Good morning, church. Well, I hope you've had a great week. We've kind of been blessed with a myriad of weather, and so we got to be outside a lot, but also got a lot of rain over in Siloam. I don't know if you guys joined us in that, but good week. I'd like to take a few minutes just to pray for the search committee. I don't think they have a report this morning, but I do know that there's a lot of work, and they're in the 11th hour. So we'll just continue to pray for them. I'm going to ask if they would stand, and let's lift them up. I know that Debbie's at home sick today, so the lone female voice on the committee, we need to especially lift her up for some strength in these days. But appreciate their work, and I know that they've had a lot of hours in the last couple weeks, more so than normal. So we need to continue to pray that they would have strength and just hear God's voice. So let's go to the Lord in prayer. I'm going to ask you to spend a moment in silence and pray for them, and then I'll close our season of prayer for them. So you pray and lift them up. Father, we're grateful that your timing is perfect, that your schedule supersedes ours. There are so many things that are out of our control that we want to control, and timing of pastors and response of pastor candidates is something that we would like to be able to control, but we can't, Father. This committee, Father, has been faithful. They've been working. They've been praying. They've been meeting. They've been seeking your face, Father, and I just pray that you would honor their heart, honor their time commitment. I pray that you would honor the investment of prayer and fasting that they've been a part of to try and sense your plan for them. So, Father, I pray in these hours of waiting, I pray, Father, that you'd give them strength, that you give them courage and discernment. Father, for the candidate that you're zeroing in on, I pray, Father, that the timing there would be perfect as well. That he would hear a clear-cut word from you on his end so that we can have a clear-cut view on our end as well. So, Father, I thank you for their work. I pray that you'd strengthen them today. Thank you for being the representatives of this body, for being true influencers and leaders here. Bless their time, Father, and thank you for their spouses who have given so much of them and shared them with us. I pray for Debbie today, Father. She's home, not feeling well. I pray that you'd give her strength as well, and just thank you for her labors on that committee. Thanks for your time, and I pray that you would speak to our hearts this morning. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you. Well, I got a question for you. What does it mean to be famous? How does someone get famous? You ever thought about that? Do they just wake up one day and say, hey, I want to be famous? If you type in the computer and the Google, for those of you who don't know, that's like a big encyclopedia. I refer to it some. Back in the day, you used to have to go to the library to look up stuff. Now you can just Google it, and it's right there. I said, what's the top 100 famous people? Now, there are several lists. There's some by, one outfit or another, and they tend to be, pretty specific by genre. Top entertainers, top athletes, top politicians, top inventors, doctors. The reality is it's hard to really have a list that covers all genres, but I found one on Biography Online, and based on the amount of people's research in that world on biographies. This is the list they came up with, and I'm not going to read all of it, but I want you to kind of set the stage. Think about, did they decide to be famous? Did they wake up to be famous? Did they decide to be remarkable? Did they wake up, or did it just happen? And listen to these names. At the top of the list was Marilyn Monroe, an actress that lived from 1926 to 62. Second on the list was Abraham Lincoln, obviously the president of the United States during the Civil War. Mother Teresa was third. She was a Catholic missionary, nun, charity worker. The fourth was John F. Kennedy. Martin Luther King was 5. Nelson Mandela was 6. Winston Churchill, who was the British Prime Minister during World War II, was 7th. Bill Gates is 8th. By the way, did y'all read that this week, that Bill Gates could buy every home in Boston and still have $1 billion left? That's crazy, isn't it? Muhammad Ali, Mahatma Gandhi, the leader of the Indian Revolution for Independence against the British. Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister. Charles de Gaulle. Christopher Columbus made the list. George Orwell. Charles Darwin. Elvis Presley. Albert Einstein. Paul McCartney. Plato. Queen Elizabeth II. That is an interesting list. But you think about the diversity on that list. From Plato, who was in the 400 BC era writer and philosopher, to Muhammad Ali. What makes a person remarkable? What makes a person worthy of making a list like that? And how do you do that? It's interesting when we think about that. And some of us maybe have our own list of who is famous and who's remarkable. But when you think about the early church, and when I say early church, Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, he appears to the disciples. They're huddled in a room. Remember, they're scared. They're the early church. He ministers to them, spends some time, a limited time frame with them, and then he ascends to heaven. And then in Acts chapter 1, we find out that there's this group of believers, and the Bible says there was about 120 of them, right? So it's a really small. So that is the beginning of what we as Elmdale Baptist Church are an extension of. That was the early church. And not early that is apart from us, it's our DNA. It's where we came from. It's the birthing experience of what you and I know as church. And it's quite different. It looked a little bit different than it looks today. But that's the early church. And so when you think about that, there were certain remarkable people that we can take away from the formation and the growth of the early church. Paul was one of those. In fact, if you Google the most researched people from America online, the Apostle Paul is one of them. So he's certainly famous. And when you think about the formation of who we are and where we've come from, he would be right there. Now, right after Jesus ascended and the early church were together and they started, Paul began doing something unique, and that was evangelizing the world. He started going on these missionary journeys and going round and round, making these circles and going on and sharing the good news. Because remember, prior to this point, the good news was only for Jewish people. But Jesus took care of that. And now all of a sudden the gospel was available for Gentiles, for non-Jewish people. And Paul was the primary impetus of this happening. And so he goes on these missionary journeys, and he's literally changing the world by spreading the good news of Christ and growing this baby infant church. So he's definitely famous, and he's remarkable. But he introduces us to a character. If you'll go to Acts chapter 16, he introduces us to a character that we're going to spend several weeks looking at, who is also remarkable. The difference between Paul and the character that he introduces us to in Acts chapter 16 is there's a definite age difference. For you young adults and for you young people, this is often the person that we look to and say, hey, don't let anybody make fun of your youth, because that was what Paul said about Timothy. Paul introduces us to this young man named Timothy, and we're going to spend several weeks looking at the life and ministry of Timothy and what makes a person remarkable. Because you see, if we're talking about it in the year 2014 and he has books written to him from Paul and they made it into the scriptures, he's a remarkable young man. He's a remarkable person. So what is it that makes him remarkable? What is it that makes him famous? And I think over the next couple weeks, we can answer that question. So as we dive into who Timothy is, the challenge to us as a church is what can we learn and what can we apply that we learn from Timothy that would make us remarkable? Or is that something that you try to do? See, I don't think Timothy tried to be remarkable. I think he tried to be. He tried to be faithful. He was a servant. He was a leader. And he allowed God to use him, and that made him remarkable. So let's begin our journey. Acts chapter 16, verse 1. Paul went first to Derbe and then to Lystra, where there was a young disciple named Timothy. His mother was a Jewish believer, but his father was a Greek. Timothy was well thought of by the believers in Lystra and Iconium, so Paul wanted to join them on their journey. In deference to the Jews of the area, he arranged for Timothy to be circumcised before they left, for everyone knew that his father was a Greek. Then they went from town to town, instructing the believers to follow the decisions made by the apostles and elders in Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened in their faith and grew larger every day. Over the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at Timothy, and today's is fascinating. It gives us the start. We're introduced to Timothy here in Acts chapter 16. Prior to this, we don't know who he is. So when we pick up on this, what we find is this is Paul's second journey to this area. And what I mean by that is he had come through this Derbe, Lystra, Iconium area once before, shortly before. And it's in chapter 15, we discover that he wants to go back, not necessarily to evangelize, but to strengthen and nurture the believers there. You see, he'd been to these areas, and he had evangelized, and people had come to know the Lord, and he started these churches, and they were all just brand new Christians. Can you imagine starting a church and no mature believers there? And he launches these churches, and so he says, hey, I want to go back and strengthen the churches. And you know what's interesting is he got in a fight with Silas about it. And because they didn't really think that was, they wanted to go somewhere else, and he wanted to go here, and the reality was he knew it was critical for their success. And so he goes on this journey. There are many who would say that it's quite possible that Timothy was one of the converts on that first journey. It would have been normal or acceptable to believe that he was in the audiences of one of those encounters that Paul had on his first journey. And so Paul's purpose was to strengthen, nurture, and help them grow and process the problems that they were encountering as a young church. So let's think about Timothy, this young man. It says he encountered a young disciple. I love that. There were obstacles against Timothy concerning his heritage and religion and his region, right? So he grew up with a Jewish mom, but a Greek dad. There was a split family home. There was a home where there was an influence of gods, plural, and God, singular. And we also know that his mom becomes a Jewish convert, so then it's really split. There's all this, and there's this. Yet the descriptor for Timothy was, when he got there was a young disciple named Timothy. It's important to stop here for a minute. He had a reputation of being a Christ follower. When you use the word disciple and me, or disciple and you, there's a connotation with that. Young disciple Timothy. Disciple of what? Disciple of Christ. He was already living, his behavior had so already collided with his beliefs that the way he lived, he earned the title disciple. Behavioral changes took place that earned him the reputation as a disciple. The behaviors that were typical disciples were seen in the early church were found in Acts chapter 1 and 2. We're not going to go there, but I can tell you what it says. It says they met regularly and studied the scriptures. They engaged those around them in prayer. These are behaviors that were different, that according to Acts chapter 2, set the early church apart. They studied the scriptures. They engaged those around them in prayer. They regularly shared meals together. I love that. We think potlucks was a Baptist tradition. No, it wasn't. It was an early church tradition. We've gotten away from that. The early church, their behavior was they would regularly get together and share meals. One of the other indicators of the early church that shaped their behavior was they gave of their possessions to those in need. This was not socialism. This was, I have something, you don't. I'm going to share with what I have and give to you. And so there was this constant evaluating of what do I have and what don't you have and how can I help. That was the descriptors. Those were the behaviors of the early church that we see in Acts chapter 1 and Acts chapter 2. And Timothy was living those out. So much so that he earned the reputation, he earned the title, disciple. So Paul shows up and he says he encounters a young disciple named Timothy. Timothy was active in those behaviors. So much so that the author designates him that. The second thing to notice is that this split family that he came from, there seems to be no indication that his dad was a Christ follower. So think about that in the backdrop of Timothy becoming a disciple. The enemy often uses our family and our heritage against us. And what I mean by the enemy is Satan is really good at creating doubt in our lives about our ability to fully follow Christ. You might hear someone say, you don't have the right pedigree. You don't have the right education. Your parents aren't the kind to get you where you need to go. Timothy's family didn't give him a leg up because there was division in the house. His dad would not have respected the singularity of purpose and focus that he had on being a disciple of Christ. Because the Greeks, where did we get the mythology and all the gods? They believed in God's plural. Timothy believed in one God, Jesus, and had given his early life to love, serve, and honor God, even though he was a young man. Verse 2, Timothy was well thought of by the disciples. That's fascinating. He had a great reputation. Now, I got to pause here and say, we don't know how old he is. All we know is that he was young. And all we know is that there are several references to his youth. And they talk about in terms of, later on in a couple of weeks, we're going to find out that there's a grandparent involved. And by the way, I'm going to have some young men up here helping us to learn these things. It's going to be fun, thinking about Timothy being young. And there's a grandparent involved. So we know that there's a generational difference, and it's significant enough that he's talked of in terms of his formation as being a young man. So here's Timothy. He's well thought of, even though he's young. Listen to Proverbs 22:1. A good name is more desirable than great riches. To be esteemed is better than silver or gold. The scriptures that they were taught every day were what? Old Testament scriptures. That's what they read. That's what Timothy read. They read the Old Testament. They read the wisdom sayings of Solomon. So these words would have resonated with Timothy. He studied the scriptures every day. Those are the ones they studied. They didn't study Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They weren't written yet. Right? So he's studying the scriptures, and he knew that. And guess what? His behavior earned him a good reputation. The scripture says the disciples, the one that's had a personal encounter with Christ and got to walk the earth with him and see his miracles and visit with him and share a cup with him, they thought well of him, even though he was young. He had a good reputation. Having a good name requires energy and effort. You cannot tell someone that you're good. You cannot tell someone you have made it or are famous. You have to show them. When we think about that list of famous people, none of them set out and said, I'm great, except maybe Muhammad Ali. And he said it repeatedly. The reality is their actions got them on a list to be noticed. Timothy's behaviors got him on a list to be noticed. The behaviors of the early church are effective even today. Bible study, worship, sharing of possessions, eating meals together. Those are things that can help you earn a reputation. But it's also being kind, serving others, and using your gifts. It's quite clear that up until this point, Timothy was focused primarily where he was, but God had a plan for him. God had given him some unique gifts and said, I want you to use them in another capacity. But I don't want to leave off one thing that requires us to have a good name, and that's consistency. If you're going to be well thought of by the local church, and you're going to be well thought of by the disciples, Timothy had one characteristic trait that we all need, and that's consistency. He lived it. He didn't act one way on Sunday and another way on Monday. If you were to, it's time that we live each day like we're intimately related to Christ. He's got to impact our speech, our behavior, our pocketbook. It's a physical manifestation of a personal relationship. And consistency is one of the number one things that we can do to earn a good reputation. Time and time again, I saw you do X. It just takes one hiccup and we get judged. One mistake and it hurts us. And so consistency, it's tough, it's hard, but Timothy did it. And we're called to do the same thing. We're called to live and do everything as to honor the Lord. Work as to honor the Lord. Live as to honor the Lord. Whatever we do, glorify the Lord. And it starts with our behaviors and our speech and our gifts and our pocketbook. Next thing is Paul saw him as someone who could, Paul looked at him and said, I want to take him on my journey. He saw him as someone that would be beneficial for him in his evangelistic and nurturing and strengthening missionary journey. And he said, I want to take him along. Think about it this way. It says the locals thought of Timothy highly, but don't you think there was a little bit of, you want to take him? Really? He's just a young man. We didn't get any of that. There was no second guesses. There was no business meeting calling saying, hey, he's too young. You can't take him. He had a good reputation by the locals. The disciples thought well of him. And when Paul encountered him, he knew he was looking in a young man's face who was completely sold on the work, life, breath, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. He was marked by his behaviors. Look at verse 3. In deference to the Jews of the area, he arranged for Timothy to be circumcised before they left, for everyone knew that his father was a Greek. This is really important, and if we had enough time, we'd go to read chapter 15, but here's what happened. The Jews were all circumcised by tradition. The Gentiles, not so much, right? There was this difference in physical attributes between those that were circumcised and those that weren't. Circumcised were the chosen, the non-circumcised were the heathens. But Jesus changed all that when he said the gospel's for the whole world. And in chapter 15, what we found was the churches outside of Jerusalem, the religious leaders were going to having converts and saying, now you've got to be circumcised. And they were fighting about it. And they're having this huge discussion. Grown men having to be circumcised. And they're like, well, we don't want to do that. And the leaders were saying, well, you got to. So what it said was the disciples and Paul went to Jerusalem and met with the early church to settle this once and for all. Does everyone need to be circumcised or not? And what they came away with was this very clear-cut list of behaviors that the early church had to adopt, and circumcision wasn't one of them. They said, no, you don't have to be. It's not a physical act that makes someone right with Lord. It's their heart. There were a few behaviors that they brought from their old to say, yeah, you got to do these, but circumcision was not one of them. And yet, one chapter later, we see Paul saying, okay, Timothy, you want to go with me? You got to be circumcised. Isn't that contradictory to the decision they just made? Didn't they just decide, including Paul, that this wasn't important, yet he's going to torture poor Timothy because he wasn't a boy. He was a young man, but he wasn't a kid. He wasn't an infant. And he's got to be circumcised? This is important. And I'll tell you why. Too many times we try to impose our standards on others, on worship, on ministry, when there's really two things to consider. Is it right or is it expedient? Is it wrong or is it best? What happened here was Paul knew that the audience that they were going to be ministering to was going to be diverse. And young Timothy would be judged unfairly because he wasn't circumcised. Could he have gone on the missionary journey and not been circumcised? Absolutely. Absolutely, because they settled it in chapter 15. But Paul was wise enough to know, why give someone the chance to stumble? Why give someone to think less of Timothy before he even gets out of the chute? Before he can say a word, let's not give them a chance to discriminate against young Timothy. He knew that his ministry would be hampered if he wasn't circumcised. So, even though he didn't have to, he did. Here's a takeaway on that. Sometimes our rights are wrong. Timothy could have refused. He could have said, no way. First of all, it's too physically painful. Secondly, you just decided as a church, all the church leaders got together and you said it's not necessary for salvation, so I don't want to do it. He was well within his rights to do that, but he would have been wrong. Sometimes our rights are wrong. Sometimes what we can do is not what we should do. Sometimes what we can do is not what we should do. They went from town to town instructing the believers to do just the opposite, because it says they went and told what they were going to these early churches. They were telling them what the church of Jerusalem, the leaders had just decided. So he's actually carrying a message that's contrary to what he just did. He got circumcised, but the message they're sharing is, hey, you don't have to do that. Isn't that fascinating? It didn't matter to this first group of believers that they were reaching immediately, but it did matter down the road when they were reaching the Jewish crowd. So Paul said, I'm going to give you every opportunity to win. We're going to cover all our bases. So here is this young circumcised Timothy going to these villages saying, you don't have to be circumcised anymore. And yet he just did it. The result, the churches were strengthened and grew larger. Did you hear that? Sometimes our rights are wrong. Young Timothy, he did what was best and expedient. And the result was the churches, right there in verse 6, says were strengthened and they grew larger every day. Timothy lived well enough to earn the title disciple. His behaviors said so. He was steeped enough in the faith and he'd studied the scriptures enough that when Paul encountered him, he earned the right to be Paul's partner in ministry. Timothy was so consistent that he was thought of well by the believers. He was willing to endure great pain and sacrifice to be a witness to people everywhere. Did you get that? It wasn't just hardship, it was physical pain. How about you? Does your current behavior reflect that of a true disciple? Does your current behavior reflect that of a true, committed believer in Jesus? Does your current behavior put you in a position to be used in ministry? Is there something about your behavior and your lifestyle that would disqualify you from being Paul's partner? Does your current behavior have a consistency to it that earns you the favor of both the believers and the leaders? Is there a consistency about you? How many times do we hear, I would have been a believer had I not encountered some? How many times do we hear those who are desperately needful of Jesus say, well, I know Christians and I don't like them. They've treated me unfairly. Consistency is a behavior of a true disciple. Does your current behavior demonstrate that you are willing to go to great lengths to be used by God? Timothy went to the length of circumcision to be used by God, even though by all rights he didn't have to. Timothy gives us a rare glimpse of someone who let his actions back up his beliefs. How about you? We're in for a journey, church. We've got a couple weeks of looking at Timothy, but it starts with this. You have a reputation. Are you a Christ follower? Can people tell? The song from the 70s says the world will know the tomb is empty when they see our hearts are full. They will know that he is living when he lives in me and you. They will know who holds tomorrow when we hold to him each day. If they don't see our hearts full, they're not going to know. If they don't see a consistency, they're not going to know. You want to be remarkable? Let God lead you. Let God have you. Go to great lengths to be a disciple. Timothy did, and he's an example for us to follow. Let's stand and pray.